The steam rising from my coffee mug was the only thing moving in the crisp Montana air, a thin gray ribbon dancing against the backdrop of a sunrise that looked like it had been painted by God himself just for me. I was sitting on the porch of the Thorne Legacy Ranch, the same weathered cypress planks that my great-grandfather had hammered into place over a century ago, feeling the ache in my knees that served as a daily reminder of 22 years in the Marine Corps, a quiet morning ritual that I wouldn't trade for all the gold in Fort Knox. It was the kind of silence you can't buy, the kind that seeps into your bones and tells you that the world is turning exactly as it should, until that silence was violently murdered by the high-pitched whine of a German engine that sounded more like a dying cat than a vehicle. I didn't even have time to set my mug down before a cloud of dust, thick and choking, came rolling up my half-mile driveway, heralded by a silver Mercedes G-Wagon with rims that cost more than my first truck, barreling towards my sanctuary with a reckless entitlement that made my stomach turn. The vehicle skidded to a halt right in front of my porch, spitting gravel onto the manicured grass I'd spent all week tending, and before the dust could even settle, the driver's door flew open to reveal a woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a Shark Tank in a Manhattan boardroom. She was wearing a white power suit that was blinding in the morning sun, heels that had no business touching ranch dirt, and she was already waving a sheaf of papers in the air like a weapon, marching towards me with a look on her face that said she was used to crushing people for sport. This was Victoria Sterling, though I didn't know her name yet. I just knew she was trouble-wrapped in expensive perfume, and she didn't even pause for a breath before she started screaming, her voice sharp enough to cut glass, telling me that I needed to vacate the premises immediately because she had bought the property and I was nothing more than a squatter on her land. I just stared at her, blinked slowly like an old owl watching a field mouse scream at a tractor, because the sheer audacity of it was almost impressive, considering the deed to this place. The real, original deed signed in ink that had turned brown with age, was sitting in a fireproof safe not 30 feet behind me, a piece of paper that proved the Thorne bloodline had bled for this dirt since 1902. This ranch wasn't just an asset. It was a living, breathing member of my family. It was where my wife, Clara, had spent her last days, sitting in this very chair, watching the sun dip below the peaks, and the idea that this plastic woman thought she could wave a paper and erase 5 generations of history was so laughable it almost didn't register as a threat. "Ma'am," I said, unfolding my 6'2" frame from the chair, letting the shadow of my bulk fall over her. "You are trespassing on private property, and I suggest you get back in that spaceship of yours and fly back to whatever planet allows people to act like this." But she just scoffed, a brittle, ugly sound, and told me that the Sterling Heights Development Corporation had acquired the title this morning and that I had 48 hours to clear out before the bulldozers arrived. She left that day with a threat hanging in the air, but I knew the type. I'd seen them in war zones and boardrooms alike. Bullies who think the world is a vending machine waiting for their credit card. But what she didn't know was that she hadn't just walked onto a ranch. She'd walked into a fortress defended by a man with nothing left to lose but his home. I thought that might be the end of it, a clerical error or a scare tactic. But 3 days later she was back, and this time she brought the suits, 2 men who looked like they were carved out of dough and squeezed into cheap polyester. One of them shoving a camera phone in my face while narrating that the subject was hostile, trying to manufacture a narrative where I was the aggressor. I felt that cold, familiar calm wash over me, the one I hadn't felt since I was in the sandbox, and I pulled out my own phone, documenting them, stating my name, Elias Thorne, stating the date, and warning them that they were trespassing on the Thorne Legacy Ranch, a move that made Victoria's eyes narrow with a venom that was pure, unadulterated hate. As they retreated, defeated by my refusal to take the bait, Victoria stopped by the railing. Looking at the climbing roses Clara had planted 40 years ago, the only living thing I had left of her touch, and with a sneer that I will remember until the day I die, she kicked the trellis, snapping the main stem, a petty, vicious act of vandalism that cracked something inside my chest, shifting this from a legal annoyance to a personal declaration of war. The escalation didn't take long. Less than a week later, the peace of the afternoon was shattered again, not by one car, but by a convoy. Pickups, a van, men in construction vests swarming my land like locusts, carrying surveying equipment, acting as if they already owned every blade of grass. Victoria was there, gloating, holding up a photocopy of a document that supposedly bore my signature, a shaky, pathetic scrawl that looked nothing like the autograph I'd signed on thousands of documents. And she told me they were there for a pre-closing inspection, a bold-faced lie designed to provoke me into doing something stupid so she could call the cops. I was about to dial the sheriff when I heard a shout from the pasture, and I looked over to see Caleb, the neighbor's kid who helped me out after school, a gentle giant of a boy, getting shoved by one of the suits, stumbling back into the old wooden fence of the holding pen. The wood groaned and snapped, a sound like a gunshot, and suddenly the barrier between the calm and the chaos was gone, releasing Titan, my 2,000-pound prize bull who had a temper shorter than a fuse on a stick of dynamite. Titan didn't care about property deeds or lawsuits. He just saw a crowd of strangers and a big, shiny white obstacle in his territory, and he lowered his head, a massive engine of muscle and fury, and charged straight for Victoria's beloved G-Wagon. The sound of impact was sickening and satisfying all at once, the crunch of German engineering crumpling like a soda can, the side of the SUV caving in as the bull lifted the front tires off the ground, shaking the vehicle like a ragdoll, while the car alarm blared a frantic, rhythmic scream that matched the terror on Victoria's face as she scrambled through the dirt, losing a shoe, diving for safety behind a pickup truck. It was chaos, absolute pandemonium, with surveyors diving into horse troughs and suits sprinting for the fence line. And by the time I managed to whistle Titan down and get the herd back under control, the Mercedes was a total loss, a twisted sculpture of metal and hubris. Sheriff Miller arrived 20 minutes later, his lights flashing, looking at the destruction with the weary eyes of a man who had seen too much city nonsense creeping into his county. And when Victoria started screaming about me being a squatter, he just held up a hand and asked for the court order, which, of course, she didn't have. He told her in no uncertain terms that a photocopied piece of paper didn't override a century of residency and a deed in a safe. And he wrote every single one of them a citation for trespassing, watching with a grim satisfaction as the tow truck dragged the carcass of her SUV away, leaving Victoria humiliated, covered in dust, swearing that this wasn't over. But as I watched the dust settle that evening, looking at the broken fence and the trampled grass, I didn't feel like a winner. I felt the heavy, suffocating pressure of a storm gathering on the horizon, because a woman like that doesn't stop when she's embarrassed. She stops when she destroys the thing that humiliated her. The days following the incident with the bull were heavy, the air on the ranch thick with a tension that felt like the drop in pressure before a tornado touches down. And even though Caleb and I repaired the fence, reinforcing it with steel posts this time, we worked in a silence that spoke louder than any words, both of us constantly scanning the horizon for a glint of chrome or the dust of approaching vehicles. I knew Victoria Sterling wasn't done. People like her don't take a loss. They view it as an invitation to escalate, to use their money and influence as a bludgeon to crush anything that stands in their way. So I started preparing for a siege, cleaning my old service pistol, an M1911 that had seen more of the world than most people, not because I wanted to use it, but because a soldier knows that it's better to have a weapon and not need it than to be staring down the barrel of bad intentions. With empty hands, I reached out to Marcus Reynolds, an old JAG officer turned ruthless civil attorney who owed me a favor or two from our days in the service. And when he saw the documents Victoria had filed, his face went pale, realizing that this wasn't just a property dispute, but a coordinated attack involving forged titles, shell companies, and a level of fraud that could only exist with deep pockets and corrupt connections. "They're trying to bleed you, Elias," he told me over lukewarm diner coffee, explaining that their strategy was death by 1,000 cuts, lawsuits, environmental inspections, animal cruelty claims, anything to drain my bank account and break my spirit, so I'd sign over the land just to make the pain stop. The psychological warfare started first, with process servers showing up at all hours, drones buzzing over my property line recording my every move, and mysterious dead calls to my landline in the middle of the night. But the real darkness arrived on a moonless Tuesday at 2 a.m. I was jerked awake not by a noise, but by that instinct that keeps you alive in the jungle, a prickly sensation on the back of my neck that screamed intruder, and I grabbed the 1911 and moved through the house like a ghost, spotting the beam of a flashlight dancing near the newly repaired barn. I slipped out the back, circling around through the brush, the cold night air biting at my skin, and caught 3 men trying to pry open the heavy doors with a crowbar, smelling the distinct, sharp tang of gasoline they had sloshed around the perimeter. I didn't hesitate. I hit them with the high beam of my tactical light and the racking slide of my pistol, freezing them in place like deer in headlights. Terror washing over their faces when they realized the feeble old man, Victoria, had described was holding them at gunpoint with a steady hand. They spilled their guts before the deputies even arrived, admitting that a blonde lady had paid them to torch the barn to destroy the equipment and force me out, a confession that Sheriff Miller took down with a grim fury, arresting them on the spot. But as they were shoved into the cruiser, one of them laughed, a cold, jagged sound, and said, "She's going to get this place anyway. Old man, you're just delaying the inevitable." But the true horror, the moment that turned my blood into ice water, came 3 days later when I returned from a meeting with Marcus to find the front gate of the ranch standing wide open, the lock sheared off with bolt cutters. My heart hammered against my ribs as I drove up the lane, seeing Caleb's truck parked haphazardly with the door open, the engine cold, and a silence over the ranch that felt violent and wrong. I ran into the house, my gun drawn, finding my sanctuary violated, drawers ripped open, Clara's photos smashed on the floor, furniture overturned, and spray painted across the living room wall. In dripping red letters were the words, "Sell or die." Panic, raw and blinding, seized me, not for the house, but for the boy, and I ran back outside screaming Caleb's name until my throat felt like it was bleeding, finally hearing a weak groan coming from the tree line behind the machine shed. I found him tied to an oak tree with baling wire, his face a swollen mask of purple and blue, one eye shut, his wrist bent at a sickening angle, beaten within an inch of his life simply for being in the way. I cut him down, my hands shaking with a rage so profound it felt like I was vibrating, holding him up as he whispered through split lips, They said this was the final warning, Mr. Thorne." And in that moment, looking at this innocent kid broken and bleeding because of Victoria Sterling's greed, something inside me snapped, not in a way that made me reckless, but in a way that clarified the world into targets and objectives. I got Caleb to the ambulance, watched the lights fade into the distance, and then I stood on my porch, the smell of the spray paint still lingering in the air, and I realized that I had been playing defense, trying to use the law to fight criminals. But you don't win a war by waiting for the enemy to stop shooting. I called Sheriff Miller, not to report a crime, but to tell him to bring the state police, the fire marshal, and every agency he could find because I had audio recordings, security footage I'd secretly uploaded to the cloud, and the testimony of the arsonists, and I was done waiting. The sun set on the Thorne Legacy Ranch that night, bathing the land in a bruised purple light, and I sat on the porch swing with a shotgun across my lap, not sleeping, just watching the road, knowing that Victoria was desperate now, knowing that her attack on Caleb was a sign that she was losing control, and that tomorrow she would come with everything she had for one final push. She thought she was coming to evict a helpless senior citizen, but she had no idea she was marching straight into a kill box designed by a man who had been hunting predators since before she was born. The dawn broke with a deceptive stillness, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like the air holding its breath before a thunderclap, and I was ready, standing at the end of my driveway, watching the horizon with the patience of a statue. It didn't take long for the invasion to appear, a snake of headlights cutting through the morning mist, led by a brand new black SUV, followed by moving trucks, private security vehicles, and enough manpower to invade a small country. Victoria Sterling stepped out of the lead vehicle wearing a pristine cream-colored suit, looking like a conquering queen, flanked by armed security guards in tactical vests who looked more like mercenaries than rent-a-cops. She marched up to the gate where I stood alone, stopping just inches from my face, and thrust a thick envelope towards me, her eyes manic and bloodshot, screaming that this was a court-ordered eviction, that the sheriff had been notified, and that if I didn't move, her men were authorized to remove me by force. I didn't take the envelope. I didn't blink. I just looked past her, a small smile playing on my lips, and asked her softly, "You really brought an army for one old man, Victoria?" She scoffed, signaling her goons to cut the lock on my gate, But before the bolt cutters could bite into the metal, a low rumble began to vibrate through the soles of our boots, a sound that grew from a hum to a roar, coming from both directions of the county road. Victoria spun around, her mouth falling open, as the cavalry arrived. Not horses, but a wall of heavy-duty pickups, tractors, and flatbeds, driven by every rancher, farmer, and veteran in the county. They boxed her convoy in, bumper to bumper, a fortress of steel and diesel, and outstepped my neighbors, Jim, the owner of the feed store, the Andersons from down the creek, veterans from the local VFW wearing their caps. And there, leaning on a crutch, battered but standing tall, was Caleb, flanked by his father and 3 brothers who looked ready to tear the world apart. They stood silently, arms crossed, a human wall protecting one of their own, and for the first time, I saw a genuine fear flicker in Victoria's eyes as she realized she wasn't just fighting a man, she was fighting a community. "This is illegal. You're kidnapping us," she shrieked, her voice cracking, but her screams were drowned out by the wail of sirens, real ones this time, as Sheriff Miller led a procession of state troopers and unmarked sedans through the blockade. He didn't look tired anymore. He looked like the hand of God as he stepped out of his cruiser, walking past her security team who were already dropping their weapons and raising their hands. He walked straight up to Victoria, who was trembling now, trying to stammer out threats about her lawyers, and he pulled out a pair of handcuffs that glinted in the morning sun. "Victoria Sterling," he announced, his voice carrying over the silent crowd. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery of legal documents, attempted arson, aggravated assault, and racketeering." The color drained from her face, leaving her looking like a wax figure melting in the heat. And when the state fire marshal stepped forward to add charges regarding the gasoline at the barn, she tried to run, a pathetic, stumbling lunge toward her car, but the deputies had her on the ground in seconds. As they hauled her away, kicking and screaming obscenities that would make a sailor blush, I watched her empire of lies crumble into the dust of my driveway. The legal fallout was swift and brutal. Marcus Reynolds used the evidence we'd gathered to dismantle the entire Sterling Heights operation, exposing a ring of corruption that spanned 3 states, sending Victoria and her associates to prison for decades. The judge threw out the fraudulent deed with prejudice, confirming that the Thorn Legacy Ranch belonged to me, and only me, forever. Months later, we rebuilt the barn, not with hired crews, but with the hands of the neighbors who had stood by me, a barn raising that ended with barbecue and laughter ringing out under the stars. While clearing the debris of the old structure, I found something in the ashes, a silver locket I had given Clara on our 25th anniversary, scorched and black, but when I pried it open, the picture inside was untouched. I sit on the porch now, the coffee hot in my hands, looking out at the mended fences and the roses blooming redder than ever on the trellis, and I think about the price of peace. We won, yes, but I look at Caleb's healing scars and the gray hairs that this war added to my head, and I wonder about a world where a piece of paper and enough greed can almost erase a life's work. Justice prevailed, but only because we fought like hell to keep it. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? If we hadn't stood up, if the neighbors hadn't come, would the law have saved us, or would the Thorn Legacy be just another parking lot for the rich?